Something shifted in the Middle East in the final days of March 2026 that most analysts are still struggling to fully process. Not on a battlefield, not in a diplomatic communique, not through a press briefing from Washington or a statement from Brussels. It happened quietly, deliberately, and with a precision that caught even the most seasoned observers off guard. Ukraine, a country still actively defending its own territory against an ongoing foreign military campaign, flew its president into the Gulf, sat down with three of the world's wealthiest energy powers, and signed a series of agreements that did not merely reshape a bilateral relationship. They rewired an entire regional security architecture. And when the full weight of what those agreements contained became clear, the silence from Tehran and Moscow said everything that needed to be said. This is not a story about weapons sales. It is not a story about diplomatic maneuvering in the traditional sense. It is a story about what happens when a nation forged in years of industrial-scale warfare exports not just hardware, but an entirely new logic of conflict, one that dismantles the central premise that its adversaries have spent decades building. Ukraine arrived in the Gulf with something far more dangerous to Iran than any missile shipment. It arrived with proof. Documented, battlefield verified, operationally demonstrated proof that Iran's most formidable strategic instrument, the mass deployment of low-cost drone swarms, can be neutralized faster, cheaper, and more decisively than anyone had previously believed possible. That proof did not come from a laboratory. It came from 4 years of absorbing the worst that both Russia and Iran could deliver from the sky. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to understand the doctrine Iran built its regional influence upon. For well over a decade, Tehran's strategy was elegant in its asymmetry. Ballistic missiles are expensive, traceable, and politically costly to deploy. Conventional military force invites direct retaliation and international condemnation. But a swarm of low-cost drones launched through a proxy network, that creates deniability, pressure, economic disruption, and fear, all simultaneously, all at a fraction of the cost of the systems required to stop them. The Shahed 136, Iran's primary export-grade kamikaze drone, costs somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000 per unit to produce. The systems that Gulf countries and their Western partners were relying on to intercept them, Patriot missile batteries, THAAD interceptors, naval defense platforms, fire rounds that cost upward of $4 million each. Tehran did not need to win battles. It only needed to keep forcing its adversaries to spend at a ratio of 100 to 1. That ratio was the weapon. And it worked. Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility, which handles roughly 5% of global daily oil supply, was struck in September 2019 in an attack that briefly took half of Saudi Arabia's oil production offline. The Houthi movement in Yemen claimed responsibility, but the technical sophistication of the strike, the precision of the targeting, and the nature of the munitions used pointed unmistakably to a more experienced hand. Gulf states spent the following years investing enormous sums in radar upgrades, air defense acquisitions, and infrastructure hardening. And still, in early 2026, Iranian-affiliated drone attacks continued disrupting energy facilities, desalination plants, and civilian infrastructure across the region. The economic and psychological toll was real, the deterrence equation remained unresolved, and no existing solution had fundamentally broken the cycle. Then Ukraine walked in and broke it. In March 2026, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky undertook what was publicly described as a Gulf diplomatic tour. The framing was deliberately understated. The reality was anything but. One after another, Zelensky met with the leadership of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. One after another, 10-year defense cooperation agreements were signed. The formal language of these agreements, joint production facilities, technology transfer, knowledge-sharing protocols, long-term procurement frameworks suggest standard defense partnership language. But what was actually being transferred had never been part of any standard defense package. Ukraine was offering something the Gulf had been unable to purchase anywhere else: the accumulated tactical, engineering, and operational knowledge of 4 years of active drone warfare at industrial scale against an adversary using the exact same weapon systems now threatening the Gulf. The human element of this transfer was immediate and substantial. Intelligence assessments and open-source documentation confirm that by the time the formal agreements were being signed, more than 228 specialized personnel had already been deployed across the region. These were not advisory teams in the conventional military assistance sense. They were drawn specifically from Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, from the General Staff, and from the SBU Intelligence Service, the precise institutions responsible for Ukraine's most advanced drone interception and electronic warfare programs. They were integrated directly into operational command networks around critical energy and infrastructure sites in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Jordan. Their mission was not to advise, it was to operate. The results were documented almost immediately. BBC field footage, verified by independent technical analysts, showed Ukrainian operators actively engaging and destroying Iranian-manufactured Shahed series drones over the Persian Gulf, using a weapon system that inverted the entire cost equation Tehran had relied upon. Ukraine's FPV interceptor drones, highly maneuverable, purpose-built, and produced at a unit cost ranging from $2,000 to $6,000, were hunting down drones that cost up to $40,000 each. The ratio had been reversed. What once favored Iran by a factor approaching 100 to 1 now favored the defense. And unlike Patriot batteries or THAAD platforms, this system could scale. Ukraine had already publicly announced production capacity targets of 2,000 defensive drones per day, contingent on adequate funding. Gulf capital, Saudi petrodollars, Qatari sovereign fund investment, UAE technological infrastructure, was now moving toward that production line. The technical architecture underlying this capability deserves careful attention, because understanding it is what reveals how deeply it threatens Iran's broader regional strategy. The system Ukraine deployed in the Gulf is not a single weapon. It is a layered, networked interception environment built from years of iterative development under live fire conditions. Acoustic sensor arrays detect drone signatures at distances and altitudes that conventional radar systems frequently miss, particularly for low-flying swarms designed to avoid detection. Mobile radar platforms, small, rapidly relocatable, and far harder to suppress than fixed installations, feed real-time tracking data into a networked command environment. Electronic warfare components specifically calibrated to the navigation and control frequencies used by Shahed series drones introduce jamming and GPS spoofing that can disorient or redirect incoming threats before they reach engagement range. And when kinetic interception becomes necessary, the FPV interceptors are guided by operators whose training did not occur in a simulation environment. It occurred over Ukrainian cities in conditions where failure meant civilian casualties and infrastructure collapse. The system works. It has been tested in the most demanding live environment imaginable, and it is now operating over the Gulf. For Iran, the military implications of this are severe, but the political implications may be even more destabilizing, because they arrive at a moment when Tehran is already under a pressure it has not experienced in recent memory from the inside. The Iranian government has been projecting a surface of controlled confidence in its public communications throughout 2026. But the gap between that public posture and what is observable inside Iran's political and economic architecture tells a different story. Senior Iranian officials, including members of the presidential office, have issued statements in recent months seeking to de-escalate tensions with neighboring states, statements that were later walked back or effectively reversed within days of their release. That pattern, where a government representative publicly signals restraint and is then publicly contradicted or overridden by events, does not reflect deliberate diplomatic strategy. It reflects internal disagreement at the level of decision-making authority. It reflects a government speaking with more than one voice and not by design. The fault line running through Tehran's leadership in the current period appears to run between civilian government institutions and the military and security establishments that have historically operated with a significant degree of independence from elected governance. The Iranian president has reportedly signaled internally and through intermediary channels a preference for reducing the pace and intensity of regional operations, not from a position of strength, but from a recognition that the economic foundation sustaining those operations is deteriorating faster than the operations themselves are delivering strategic returns. That assessment is correct, and it is contested within the Iranian system by institutions that have organizational, ideological, and financial incentives to maintain an aggressive regional posture regardless of economic conditions. This internal tension is not a new feature of Iranian politics, but what is new is the severity of the economic context in which it is now playing out. Iran's economy in early 2026 is under a combination of pressures that compound one another in ways that are increasingly difficult to manage through internal policy adjustment. Oil export revenue, the single most important financial pillar of the Iranian state, is being constrained simultaneously by Western sanctions enforcement, by shipping route disruptions in and around the Persian Gulf, and by a reduction in the number of willing buyers prepared to absorb the political risk of Iranian crude at current international tension levels. When the revenue flows shrink, every other economic variable deteriorates faster. Inflation in Iran has been running at levels that are making ordinary daily commerce structurally difficult. Food prices have increased sharply over a compressed time frame. Basic goods, cooking oil, flour, protein staples, have become measurably less accessible for a significant portion of the Iranian population operating in the lower and middle economic bands. The rial, Iran's national currency, has continued its long-term depreciation trajectory against major currencies, with periodic sharp drops coinciding with military escalation events that spook whatever residual investor confidence remains in the Iranian financial system. The government's response to accelerating inflation has included the issuance of higher denomination banknotes, a technical adjustment that economists consistently identify as a trailing indicator of monetary stress rather than a solution to it. On the street level, more Iranians are operating increasingly in physical cash rather than through formal financial channels, reflecting a widening distrust of the banking system's stability. The internet shutdown dimension of Iran's current crisis carries economic consequences that extend well beyond political suppression. Large-scale connectivity restrictions, which Iranian authorities have deployed with increasing frequency in response to domestic unrest, do not merely limit the flow of political information. They sever the operational communications of hospitals managing supply chains under resource constraints. They disrupt the order processing systems of manufacturing businesses dependent on imported components. They create payment processing failures across commercial sectors that have already been weakened by years of sanctions-driven isolation. Each shutdown compounds the structural damage to an economy that cannot easily absorb additional friction, and each shutdown that extends beyond 24 hours represents a measurable GDP contraction in a system with limited buffers remaining. The Strait of Hormuz factor introduces a dimension of strategic self-contradiction that is worth examining precisely because it reveals how constrained Tehran's options have become. Iran has long maintained the Strait of Hormuz as its ultimate deterrent, the implicit or explicit threat that a sufficiently cornered Iran could disrupt the passage of approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply through a 33-mile-wide choke point. That threat has historically given Iran leverage in international negotiations, created anxiety in global energy markets at moments of regional tension, and served as a baseline deterrent against military action by external actors who might otherwise be less cautious. The threat is real. The strait is genuinely vulnerable to Iranian interdiction. The economic consequences of even a partial disruption would be severe and global. But here is the trap that threat has become. In early 2026, observable shipping traffic data indicates that Iran has been allowing oil tankers and commercial vessels to transit the strait with a notably lower rate of interference than the period of peak regional tension might have predicted. The interpretation most consistent with available evidence is not that Iran has decided to be magnanimous. It is that Iran needs those ships to move. Not the ships of adversaries. The ships carrying Iranian crude, often under third-party flags and through indirect routing arrangements to buyers who provide the hard currency that is keeping Iran's fiscal situation from deteriorating further still. The Strait of Hormuz threat is most powerful when Iran does not need to use it. The moment Iran's own economic survival depends on shipping traffic flowing through that same strait, the threat loses much of its coercive value. Tehran built a weapon that it now cannot fire without shooting itself. This is the structural context into which Ukraine's Gulf partnerships arrived, not simply a moment of Iranian regional overreach, a moment when Iran's central strategic logic, cheap coercion through deniable violence backed by the implicit threat of energy market disruption, was simultaneously being neutralized from the outside by Ukrainian technology and undermined from the inside by economic exhaustion. The timing was not accidental. It was the product of years of Ukrainian strategic development intersecting with a regional security environment that had become desperate for exactly what Ukraine could offer. Russia's position in this reconfiguration is worth understanding with equal precision, because what is happening in the Gulf is not simply a bilateral Ukraine-Iran story. It is a three-party structural collapse, and Moscow's role in creating the conditions for its own strategic setback is one of the most consequential ironic outcomes in recent geopolitical history. Russia's relationship with Iran's drone program was not passive. According to multiple international intelligence assessments, Russia in the early phase of its military campaign in Ukraine acquired first-generation Iranian Shahed drones, deployed them on the Ukrainian front, studied their operational limitations under real combat conditions, and then transmitted engineering refinements back to Iran, improvements to navigation systems, anti-jamming capabilities, and guidance precision. The Kremlin's strategic logic was to create a more capable Iranian drone force that would serve Russian interests by pressuring the US-Israeli axis in the Middle East while simultaneously depleting the attention and resources of Western partners. What that process actually created was the world's most combat-experienced counter-drone force. Every Shahed variant Russia deployed over Ukrainian cities, and every technical improvement Russia helped introduce into subsequent Iranian production runs, was met, analyzed, and ultimately countered by Ukrainian engineers and operators working under direct fire pressure to develop interception solutions that would actually work in operational conditions, not in test ranges, not in controlled environments, but in the middle of a conflict where failure had immediate and lethal consequences. Russia refined the threat. Ukraine refined the counter. And when that counter arrived in the Gulf, it arrived already calibrated against the precise variants of the weapon it was designed to destroy. The Russian defense export dimension of this story carries an economic weight that Moscow's strategists are actively grappling with. Arms sales are not a peripheral element of the Russian economy. They are a significant source of hard currency revenue, a vehicle for maintaining influence relationships with client states, and a central pillar of the Russian defense industrial sector's institutional survival. The Middle East has historically been one of Russia's most important arms markets. Saudi Arabia engaged in extended negotiations over the S-400 air defense system. Egypt operates significant Russian-origin military platforms. The UAE has examined Russian hardware across multiple procurement categories. For Russia, maintaining a credible reputation as a provider of effective military technology in the Middle East was not merely commercially valuable. It was strategically essential for sustaining the network of relationships that allowed Moscow to project influence in a region where it had no permanent military presence comparable to its Soviet-era footprint. Ukraine's performance in the Gulf has materially damaged that reputation in a market that was already skeptical. Gulf procurement officials are not abstract strategists. They are professionals tasked with defending some of the world's most economically critical infrastructure against a genuine threat. When they observe that Ukrainian-developed systems are intercepting the same drones that Russian-origin air defense platforms failed to stop reliably in multiple documented incidents, the conclusion they draw is not theoretical. It is practical. The contracts that are being signed in 2026 are not going to Moscow. They are going to Kyiv. The production lines being funded by Gulf sovereign wealth are not in Russia, they are in Ukraine, and the defense technology relationships being formalized through 10-year agreements are not positioning Russia as a security partner. They are positioning Russia as an object lesson in what a defense relationship built on outdated hardware and strategic miscalculation actually costs. The internal dynamics within the Iranian government are likely to intensify as the cumulative weight of these developments becomes clearer to all factions within the decision-making structure. The civilian leadership's reported preference for de-escalation reflects a rational reading of the economic damage that continued regional operations are inflicting on a population already under significant strain. Large-scale civil unrest in Iran is not a hypothetical scenario, it is a documented historical pattern. Protest movements in 2009, 2019, and 2022 each emerged from intersections of economic grievance and political discontent that, while suppressed through security measures, demonstrated the latent pressure that exists beneath the surface of Iranian public life. The government's ability to suppress dissent depends on the continued loyalty and operational capacity of security institutions that themselves require funding, legitimacy, and the perception of strategic success to maintain cohesion. None of those conditions are improving. The drone program that represented a centerpiece of Iran's strategic identity, a domestic innovation success story, a source of asymmetric power against vastly better resourced adversaries, a demonstration that Iran could compete technologically on its own terms, is now being publicly neutralized by a country that is simultaneously fighting for its own survival. The psychological and institutional blow this delivers to the Iranian military establishment is not trivial. Programs that cost billions of dollars and decades of engineering investment are being rendered operationally ineffective not by American stealth technology or Israeli precision strikes, but by commercially scaled FPV interceptors developed in Kyiv. The question of who bears responsibility for this failure and how the costs of that failure are distributed within the Iranian system is a question that is almost certainly generating significant internal friction. The broader strategic architecture that emerges from this moment is worth understanding in its full dimensions, because what Ukraine has done in the Gulf is not simply a military or economic development, it is a geopolitical repositioning of considerable permanence. Ukraine, by providing battlefield-proven technology that directly addresses the primary security threat facing Gulf states, has inserted itself into the core of a regional security relationship that has historically been managed almost exclusively by the United States and, to a lesser extent, the United Kingdom and France. This is not a replacement of those relationships, but it is a significant diversification that gives Gulf states leverage they did not previously have in managing their security arrangements. For Zelensky's government, the strategic value of this repositioning extends well beyond the financial terms of the defense agreements, significant as those terms are. Ukraine's most immediate strategic need is to prevent its isolation, to demonstrate to a global audience that it remains a viable, credible, and indispensable partner, rather than a beleaguered state dependent entirely on the goodwill of Western governments subject to political fluctuation. The Gulf partnerships achieve that objective in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They provide capital flows into Ukraine's defense industrial capacity. They generate international diplomatic relationships that complicate any narrative of Ukrainian marginalization. They demonstrate Ukrainian technological credibility on a global stage in a way that no battlefield report or government press release could achieve independently. And they create structural interdependencies that give some of the world's most influential economies a concrete stake in Ukrainian operational continuity. The forward trajectory of this situation contains several specific signals worth monitoring closely. The pace at which Gulf sovereign wealth funds translate signed framework agreements into actual capital deployed into Ukrainian production lines will indicate whether the strategic alignment is being backed by genuine financial commitment or is remaining at the level of politically convenient symbolism. The response of Iranian military institutions to the documented failure of their primary remote pressure instrument will determine whether Tehran recalibrates toward diplomatic engagement, as economic logic increasingly demands, or doubles down on development of countermeasures to Ukrainian interception technology in a technological competition that Iran is currently losing from a position of accelerating resource constraint. The internal Iranian political tension between civilian leadership and military institutions will likely become more visible, not less, as economic pressure intensifies and the strategic returns from regional operations continue to diminish. Russia's response to the erosion of its Middle Eastern arms market will manifest in defense export posture, in diplomatic pressure on Gulf states to reconsider or limit Ukrainian partnerships, and potentially in attempts to provide Iran with technical assistance aimed at restoring the operational effectiveness of its drone program. Whether those efforts succeed will depend heavily on whether Ukraine's engineering community, now backed by Gulf capital, can continue to develop interception capabilities faster than Iranian and Russian engineers can develop countermeasures. Based on the trajectory of the past 4 years, that is a competition Ukraine has demonstrated a structural advantage in maintaining. What has fundamentally changed is this: Iran's most consequential strategic instrument, the one that made it genuinely dangerous to adversaries who could not be confronted conventionally, has been shown in operational conditions to be neutralizable by systems that cost less to produce than the drones they destroy. That revelation does not simply weaken Iran's military posture. It restructures the entire cost-benefit calculation that regional and global actors make when they assess the risk of confronting or constraining Iranian behavior. A weapon that derives its power from being economically overwhelming to counter ceases to be that weapon the moment a cost-effective countermeasure is deployed at scale. And scale is precisely what the Gulf agreements now make possible. Iran is not finished as a regional actor. Its ballistic missile program remains substantially intact. Its relationships with proxy organizations across the region retain significant operational depth. Its intelligence and influence networks are not eliminated by a shift in drone interception dynamics, but the leverage Tehran derived specifically from the combination of drone pressure and implied energy market risk, the two instruments that gave it coercive power against adversaries it could not confront in open conflict, have both been materially weakened simultaneously, one by Ukrainian technology deployed in the Gulf, the other by the economic logic that is now forcing Iran to keep shipping lanes open despite the strategic value it previously derived from threatening to close them. The situation is more constrained for Tehran than at any point in the past decade. The options are fewer, the resources are thinner, the internal disagreements are louder. And the adversary that has done the most to accelerate that constraint is not the superpower across the Atlantic. It is a country of 40 million people that spent 4 years turning the weapons aimed at its own cities into the foundation of a new global security industry. That is what changed in March 2026. That is why it matters. And the signals to watch: Gulf capital flows into Ukrainian production, Iranian internal political signaling, Russian diplomatic pressure in the region, and the pace of counter-technology development in Tehran will determine whether this represents a permanent strategic shift or the opening move in a longer and more complex contest. Right now, every observable indicator points toward the former, but the situation remains in motion, and the actors with the most to lose are not done responding. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.